Welcome back to the Haynes Report. I'm Carole Haynes. Our topic for today's discussion is removing Arlington's Confederate monument is about political power and division, not racism. The woke crowd has been on an American monument destruction rampage for literally years. Now they've targeted the most hallowed ground in America for their next demolition project, the Arlington National Cemetery Reconciliation Monument. Demolition of this monument will be proof that the woke crowd is implementing a plot to erase the history of America, to divide our people, and to destroy citizens' appreciation and connection to a vital part of our history, and that's the reconciliation between the North and the South following the Civil War. The woke crowd is claiming that the Arlington Confederate Monument absolutely has to be destroyed because it represents, of course, racism. But that's the neo-Marxist Maoist disguise to cover their real agenda. Their real agenda is to create division, to get Americans fighting against each other, to destroy absolutely everything about America's past, and then they will assume political power and control of the greatest nation on earth. Well, going back as far as the Civil War, Northern liberal historians have ignored the facts and rewritten history about the economic, the cultural, and the religious differences between the North and the South, and then the underlying issues that led to the Civil War, while claiming that slavery was the one and the only cause of the war. Neo-Marxists found in this narrative their new victim class for their intent to divide Americans. Their radical agenda was greatly accelerated with the COVID lockdown of 2020 and the death of George Floyd. Unprecedented property destruction across America was orchestrated by this far-left coalition of violent anarchists and the Marxist-led Black Lives Matter group. Then they systematically began the destruction of American heritage monuments, the statues of Christopher Columbus, who discovered America and opened the way for European colonization, and Confederate leaders of slaveholding southern states. Then the woke crowd targeted the founders and their homes and even the churches that our founders attended. In many states, all monuments and statues of Columbus and the Confederate leaders and anything about the Confederacy and the Civil War have been removed. Often they've been taken down very violently and broken apart, thrown in the lakes or whatever. Streets, schools, buildings, ships, everything that has a Confederate link has been renamed or removed. Now the historical destruction of America has moved to a whole new level, the federal level. In 2021, Congress passed the fiscal year Pentagon budget that was vetoed by President Trump because it included the naming commission. Congress overrode his veto, though, and they charged the Pentagon's naming commission to rid the entire military inventory of roads, buildings, installations, awards, insignia, memorials, and any other manifestations of references to the Confederacy and the Confederate combatants who served the South voluntarily. In the Commission's third and final report, the panel recommended that the Army, which runs the Arlington National Cemetery, strip the Confederate monument of its bronze, including the 32 figures, the plaques honoring the 14 states who sent soldiers to fight for the Confederacy, and the large female figure holding the wreath of olive branches at the top. There's also a recommendation to destroy the bronze work created by sculptor Moses Ezekiel. All that would remain would be the granite base with the educational signage. Congress specifically put grave markers outside the Commission's remit, so while the artwork is removed, the grave markers function of the memorial's base remains. The Naming Commission and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin have illegally slated the 109-year-old memorial for demolition. Austin's order to remove or demolish the Reconciliation Memorial is illegal because the memorial serves as the headstone for the monument's famed sculptor, who was also a Confederate veteran. And there were also 3 other veterans there, along with two wives. Being a headstone puts it beyond the so-called Naming Commission's mandate. As an excuse for their barbaric recommendations, the Naming Commission views the figures around the base through the lens of racism, with the focus being on slavery. But the monument is absolutely not about slavery, nor is it about racism. And that is the problem. This does not serve their purpose. that they would have to admit that the North profited from the slave trade and slave-produced cotton, and Lincoln's commitment to preserving the Union. They don't want that message to come out. The narrative must be only focused on one thing, that slavery was an exclusive Southern thing, Confederate thing, so anything Confederate must be destroyed. The Army historian called the monument a disguise for white supremacy. This is a common Marxist cover, though, to divert attention from what they're really doing from their neo-socialist agenda. Marxists conveniently ignore that race relations were better in the South than in the North, with the worst relations being over in New England. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his Democracy in America, the famous book that he wrote, noted that this fact about race relations was very well known at that time. What's interesting is that several northern states had laws forbidding blacks from even visiting the North more than a few days. They were not allowed to come in and just live there unless they were slaves, and there were black slaves there, but freedmen could not come in there and live or even visit more than a few days. It was New England shippers who brought slaves from other Africans. They brought them to the New England shores. The Marxists conveniently ignore the horrific conditions under which these captors were brought to the North on these slave ships. They were chained to decks in the bottom of the ships. It was stifling hot down there. There was no ventilation. They had to live there for months in chains, in urine, in feces, in vomit, and death. 6 slave states fought for the Union to end slavery, yet they continued slavery in their states until the 13th Amendment ended in 1865. You recall that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation only pertained to those slave states that had seceded. It did not affect those that stayed in this Union, even though they had slaves and were continuing the slave importation. The socialist W.E.B. Du Bois, in his famous The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States of America, 1638 to 1870, wrote that Boston and New York were the largest slave trading ports in the world in 1862, and they remained so into the war between the states and even 54 years after the 13th Amendment had ended slavery. The woke crowd claims it was only because of slavery that the South seceded. That is a lie. They deny the fact that the Northern economy would literally have collapsed because it was based almost entirely on their manufacturing for the South, and their shipping Southern cotton around the world. You see, the North needed the South. The South did not need the North. So why are the woke not changing the name of Brown University that was founded by a Northern slave trader, or the hall that was named after him, Faneuil Hall? Because Peter Faneuil was a slave trader. Why are they ignoring that fact? Since the South provided more than 75% of the budget, why didn't the federal government just purchase the freedom of Southern slaves? The reason is because freedmen would then go to the North and serve as job competition. Remember what I said a few minutes ago about several states had laws forbidding free blacks from living in the North? Another reason why the federal government did not buy the freedom of slaves, the 6 slave states that had fought for the North would have seceded immediately over federal overreach, and they would have joined the Confederacy, just as Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas did. Those first 4 southern states at first rejected secession and only joined the Confederacy, only seceded when Lincoln called up 75,000 volunteers and told them to invade the South, to force the South back into the Union so that the federal government wouldn't lose the income from the South. Oh yeah, they have this big story about firing on Fort Sumter, and that's another story for another time. That too was a lie. So what is the purpose of the Reconciliation Monument? The first reason is that it commemorates the more than 400 Confederate soldiers and their wives laid to rest at Section 16, along with all the other Southern soldiers who never returned home. Many marched in unmarked graves. They were buried there, scattered all over the South. That's why there were so many Confederate monuments erected at courthouses across the South, because those were monuments. They were memorials of veterans for family members whose sons and brothers and husbands did not return. So they didn't have graves except vague graves that had nothing but a headstone. They were buried in unmarked graves all over the South, so nobody knew where they were. By having these monuments at courthouses, this was a place for the families to have a place where they could go, they could see, and they could remember their loved ones that had not returned. Now, most of these have been removed by hate-filled left-wing radicals. The second reason is that the monument is a testament to the reuniting of the American people after a horrible war and a tyrannical reconstruction by the radical Republicans. And radical Republicans are also another story for another time. So let's consider why the Reconciliation Monument is so important to us as Americans. Arlington Cemetery is the most hallowed ground in America, with a very direct link to both our founding family, George Washington, and the Confederacy's leading family, Robert E. Lee. George Washington married Martha Custis, who was a widow with 2 children, and she had inherited Arlington Plantation. She and her husband owned that. And when her husband was deceased, then it went to Martha Custis. When Martha Custis married George Washington, then her son then died, and when that son died, George Washington adopted his young son. So this was essentially Martha Washington's grandson and George Washington's step-grandson. And this young boy was reared at Mount Vernon, which is where the Washingtons lived, not at Arlington Plantation. Custis, the grandson, built the house at Arlington that was inherited by Mary Custis, and his daughter, Mary Custis was his daughter, and Mary Custis was also the future wife of Robert E. Lee, so her name was Mary Custis Lee. After Mary inherited Arlington from her father, who was the grandson of Martha Washington, Lee set about freeing those slaves prior to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Because he opposed slavery, he did not fight to preserve slavery. Many think that Lee owned slaves. He did not. He was freeing the slaves. He was not fighting to preserve slavery. What he was fighting for was the right of Southern states to secede from the Union, just as the colonies had seceded from Great Britain. There was no difference there. Regardless of what we hear from the left, regardless of what we hear from all of these liberal historians, that's another story again. After the war between the states began and Lee had accepted command of the Confederate Army rather than the Union Army that was offered to him by Lincoln, the federal government seized Arlington Plantation. By 1864, Union Secretary of War Edward Stanton had already begun conversion of the property to a national cemetery, and it was for Union and Confederate soldiers, and they put Major General Montgomery Meigs in command. Well, the Confederate military personnel were initially not supposed to be buried there, and this is not the way it was to be done, but this is the way that the North wanted it done. They did not want any Confederates buried in this national cemetery. But because some of these Confederates were prisoners of war who died in custody under the Union Army, under the Union, some of them were also executed as spies, so their bodies were there, and if they'd been prisoners of war, then they had died in custody. So there were bodies there, either as spies or dying in custody, so they buried them there in Arlington. There were bodies of more than 2,000 Union Confederate soldiers within a 35-mile radius of Washington, D.C., and those remains were gathered up, and they were brought into the National Cemetery. Some of these remains of these Southern soldiers had been buried on the field, but most of them were the bones, the bodies were just left on top unburied, and so you had some partial corpses and some full corpses. Meigs had not intended to gather these remains out there because he really did not want to mark their graves. He was that hostile to the South. However, the inability to identify the remains allowed Confederate dead to be buried along with the Union dead in the cenotaph there in the cemetery that was constructed in 1865. And then after those bodies were in there, they sealed the vault in 1866. So the total count of Confederate military buried at Arlington is more than 400 out of more than 400,000 graves today of veterans and their wives. The Reconciliation Monument signals an important moment in the history of America, and that moment is the spiritual and emotional reconciliation of the hatred and the war between the two sections, between the North and the South. The federal government had created a lot of suffering. They were very hostile to the South, and they were doing anything that they could to, and that's something that I will talk about at a later time, what the cruelty that was inflicted on the Southern people. And most of the Southern people did not even have slaves. They were not fighting to defend slavery. They were fighting because their farms, their homelands, their states were taken over. Many of them lost their farms to the North, just moved in and took over their land and their houses, their food, their animals. And the federal government inflicted this horrible suffering and poverty among both the whites, but it also affected the former slaves. And this was this heavy hand of Reconstruction. And then the carpetbaggers came in, and they were really stealing everything. And the South was struggling so to rebuild, and it made it very hard on everybody. And the free blacks were even worse off. Now there was just no food anywhere. There was nowhere for them to stay. All of this created anger and resentment among Southerners, and that fed into the problems that we had with the Democrat Party, who at that time was what Southerners were, but that fed into all the things that came out of it later. Yet when the country engaged in the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Southern Confederate states pitched in to fight beside Union soldiers. So they assumed that because the Confederate states had left the Union, the Southern states were not hostile to the extent like the Northern states were. This war lasted only, in the Spanish-American War, it lasted only 4 months. But the Southern states, when I said they were not hostile, let me put it this way. They were back in the Union, and because they were fighting in the war, they saw this was a necessity because now they were part of America, and the Spanish-American War affected America. And so they were now Americans and not just the South and the Confederacy. This Spanish-American War lasted only 4 months, but during that period of time, a spirit of reconciliation and teamwork developed between the Northern and the Southern soldiers. Well, President McKinley, who is a decorated Union veteran, recognized the importance of reconciliation to building a strong military. So in 1900, he supported a bill to establish a Confederate section in Arlington Cemetery, telling the nation, and I quote, "Sectional feeling no longer holds back the love that we bear each other. The Union is once more the common altar of our love and loyalty, our devotion and sacrifice," end quote. About 260 of the Confederate bodies were brought from various burial places to this designated section of Arlington Cemetery. A few years later, Secretary of War William Taft, who also became a future president, received a request to erect a monument in that designated area, and they were going to call it Section 16. The request was granted in 1906. Moses Ezekiel, who is a world-renowned American sculptor, he was also the first Jewish cadet at Virginia Military Institute, and as I said earlier, he was a Confederate Army veteran. He created this Confederate memorial in his Italian workshop in Rome. He was so famous, he was asked to create a peace monument to capture the spirit of reconciliation, and it was to serve as a memorial to the hundreds of dead Confederates who were buried in this Section 16 and to commemorate the reunification of the North and the South. In 1912, President Taft presided over this cornerstone dedication cemetery, which he called a benediction of all true Americans. He described the future monument as a beautiful monument to the heroic dead of the South. On June 14th, on June 4th, 1914, President Woodrow Wilson unveiled the completed monument, calling it an emblem of a united people. In his speech at the dedication, Wilson spoke about the reconciliation that the monument represented, and he declared that this chapter in America's history was closed. He said this: "My privilege is this, ladies and gentlemen, to declare this chapter in the history of the United States closed and ended, and I bid you turn with me with your faces to the future, quickened by the memories of the past, but with nothing to do with the contests of the past, knowing as we have shed our blood upon opposite sides, we now face and admire each other." And that is just the point. The Marxist strategy is not to leave that chapter of American history closed, but rather to divide and to conquer us. The woke wants to undo the reconciliation between the North and the South. They want to take down all of our American heritage monuments. They want to reopen old wounds on a chapter of history that has long since been closed. James Ronald Kennedy, who is the chief of the National Sons of the Confederate Veterans Heritage Operations, says that one of the signals that a war is over and that peace is achieved is when the defeated enemy is allowed to honor their war dead. And, he said that if the victorious side starts to desecrate their enemy's war memorials, it means that the war is back on. Yes, it does. The Marxists are telling us that war is on, that they are at war with us, American people, with the grassroots, with our constitutional republic. Their ultimate goal is a new world order with no sovereign America. Their cultural revolution began with little things, infiltrating our institutions, getting legislation passed. At no time were they ever stopped, and now they're emboldened to finish their agenda. Unless we stop this demolition of our national monument, that will be a signal to them that they are winning, and then they will have little opposition to a complete takeover at the federal level. This is a big, big thing because it's a signal to them that it doesn't matter, that they do whatever they want to us and we will not push back. This is really akin to allowing tiny children to throw little temper tantrums to get their way, and then parents allow them to get their way, and then they continue it all the way through middle school as the teenagers, and then they grow up and they continue to have bad behavior and they continue to be out of control because there's been nothing to stop them along the way. It's too late to change the people as adults. Well, that's where we are now as a nation. These left-wing thugs are mentally ill. They're totally out of control because we did not stop them decades ago. They're vicious, they're ruthless, they will go to any length to take down the grassroots of America. And you can see they will even resort to murder. So in wrapping up this episode, we know that the Hate America crowd is not going to stop with this reconciliation monument. Every veteran in America should be absolutely outraged because this is what could happen to your memory in the future by power-hungry politicians. Do you remember what happened to our Vietnam veterans after the Vietnam War? How badly they were treated, how viciously they were attacked, and they became basically the enemy. And yet these people were sent off against their wishes often, and they fought for America, and they came back maimed, and they came back hated. Perhaps 100 million Americans today are descended from Confederate soldiers and the men and women who supports the Southern War for Independence. Are they going to be targeted? I'm talking about 1/3 of Americans are descended from these people in the South and from these Confederate soldiers. What's going to happen? Will your graves be targeted? Will your graves be desecrated next? You would think that the government would think twice about angering the South since we're in a military recruiting crisis and 44% of the U.S. military is recruited from the South. What fools they are. So powerful was the feeling of reconciliation that Arlington Memorial Bridge that was built in that same era was purposely laid out to connect the Lincoln Memorial with Arlington House. And remember, Arlington House was the former home of Robert E. Lee's wife, her father, her family. This was another symbol of national reconciliation. However, the naming commission is not taking that bridge down because it goes to the Lincoln Memorial and is getting a multi-million-dollar restoration instead of being demolished. There's something wrong with that picture. The woke intend to remove every last vestige of our heritage and our culture so that the America we once knew will be totally different. It'll be different in terms of government, culture, people, the landscape, everything. Everything that you see around us will be gone. You see, the woke have read George Orwell's book, 1984, where he wrote, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and liberate their own understanding of their own history." And that's exactly what's being done by dividing the people over the slavery issue that ended nearly 160 years ago. It was dominant in both the South and the North, and as well as in numerous other countries. It was more prominent in other countries than in the United States. And in fact, slavery exists today worldwide and even in the United States. And that's another thing that is with our immigration, is that we do have slave trafficking. Most people are followers and they will not get actively involved. We have to blame ourselves because we have allowed these satanic thugs to steal our country, to steal our God-given freedoms. Unless people are willing to stand up, to take a stand for freedom, we are going to live in poverty. And even those of us who are willing to stand up, we will go down with the rest of those who are not willing to stand up. We will live in poverty. We will live in slavery like those in China, Venezuela, and Cuba. We have seen how successful a massive coalition of parents rising up to protect their children against child abuse. We see how effective that has been. We have no choice but to do the same if we're really serious about stopping the complete takeover of the federal government and decimation of our culture as the complete loss of freedom and property. America needs your help. Here's what hundreds of thousands are going to have to do. It's not a please will you do it, it's we have to do it. Number one, there's a petition that was started by Christina Bell, and here's how you can find it. Now, I am placing this transcript on my website, and you can go in there and find it, and you can get the link from my website, but let me just read to you, or rather tell you what you can do since you're not reading it right now. Go to your search engine and type in this, change.org, Arlington Reconciliation Memorial Petition. Let me repeat that. Put into your search engine, change.org, Arlington Reconciliation Memorial Petition. Then there's a second thing you can do, and you've got to do it now before September the 2nd. This is very important. After the Defend Arlington Reconciliation Memorial Petition was created, the ANC opened a comment period. They were getting a lot of flack, so they opened a comment period on destruction of the Confederate Memorial. So before September 2nd, go to your search engine and type in ANC, that's Andrew, Nancy, Charlie, Confederate Memorial Public Comments. Let me repeat that, ANC Confederate Memorial Public Comments. Then once you're at that website, it will a form will pop up, and add your comments and use the material that I've talked about and put your comments in there, everything that you want to say. And don't worry about being so passive. We have to take a stand here. Well, folks, that wraps it up for this episode. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. Do come back again. In the meantime, please share this podcast. Remember to make your comments at the ANC link, and check out my website, www.drcarolehaynes.com, for my commentaries and other podcasts. Let me repeat that, www.drcarolehaynes.com, and there you will find a transcript also for this, so you can get those links.